Let's move on then into talking about some of the issues related to culture and society. Both in thinking about how did the culture of the time, the Roman culture of the time, look at Christians, and how did Christians attempt to speak to the culture of the time. As we've seen already, there was a lot of suspicion and concern about Christians. And a variety of things were said about Christians. That they were atheists, they practiced incest and cannibalism, they worshipped a donkey, they're not intellectuals like the philosophers, they're from the lower classes, they're not good citizens. All of these things were said about Christians. Now, the one about atheists might seem off, but as we've talked about, I believe we mentioned this earlier, the fact that they did not believe in the Greek and Roman gods made them atheists in the mind of the Romans, even though they did believe in God. They practiced incest and cannibalism. Well, the fact that they called each other brother and sister, sometimes even were married, referring to each other as brother and sister, meant it was incest to some of the people, some of the Romans at the time. What about cannibalism? Where do you think that would have come from? The Lord's Supper, right? And so there's this discussion. You hear these people saying that they eat babies baked in bread, right? Because God's child Jesus, His body is the bread, and so and so a lot of misunderstandings of things is what comes out of this. The donkey one, which I didn't put up on this list, there is a piece of graffiti that shows a crucified man with a donkey's head and another individual kind of worshiping him with the subscription, Alexamenos worships his God. And with it being crucifixion, right, hanging on a cross, it appears to be that it's referring to Christ, and that Alexamenos was a Christian. The donkey head thing, though, is unclear. It's probably based on the belief that was current at the time that Jews worshipped a donkey. And that kind of carried over into Christianity, right? Christianity connected with the Jewish God, so where the Romans and Greeks got the idea that Jews worshipped a donkey, however, is unclear. We know that they talked about it. We just don't know what it was that caused them. I don't think it was like Balaam. Right? Somebody heard the story of Balaam. I mean, that's the only thing I could think of that even remotely. But as far as the historical evidence as to why and where this came from, is completely unclear.
Maybe more so with Christ in that, I mean, the triumphal entry was such a big entrance as the gospel writers claim it was, and that was seen, and then I guess they kind of like made fun of them that way.
Yeah, that might be a possibility too, but it seems like they had this idea about Jews even before. But like I said, there's no clear evidence.
Yeah.
One of the earliest individuals to attack Christianity, to promote some of these ideas, was a man named Celsus. And he writes in his document, The True Word. The manuscript for The True Word has been lost. We know only about Celsus's attacks because a 3rd century Christian named Origen, who we'll talk about next week, quotes large parts of The True Word in attempting to defend against it. And so that's the only way we have copies of this. But essentially, a lot of what he attacks Christianity on is not necessarily some of these first things, but these last couple. The Christians are uncultured. Right? They come from women, children, and slaves. Right? And so there's this kind of lower class nature about them. They talk about things they don't understand, says Celsus. They're ignorant. And ultimately, he asks the question, why would an omniscient God have to visit earth? If God knows everything, why does he have to come to earth? Now again, a lot of this suggests where many of the converts to Christianity were coming from. There's indication, though, that Christianity was found among upper-class men as well. But it's getting the stereotype of the only people that are approving or becoming a part of Christianity are those lower classes. Other attacks included referring to it as a barbarian religion that comes from the outskirts of the Roman Empire, so it's not civilized like Greek or Roman religion. They would argue that anything good in Judaism came from the Greeks, so arguing that they plagiarized the Greeks. The God of Judaism and Christianity was considered to be ridiculous. He's omnipotent and transcendent and separate from the rest of the universe on the one hand, but he's a busybody involved in everything on the other. Christianity destroys society because Christians aren't involved in those social activities. They won't participate in the sacrifices that are part of the city life. They won't participate in the sacrifices to the emperor. And so the argument becomes, if you believe the gods are fake, why do you avoid them? What harm is it going to do to worship the gods that you believe don't exist? Now, for Christians, it's still a matter of you're still giving your allegiance to someone, even though you might not believe it exists. But the Romans are thinking, well, just pretend to worship, even if you don't believe it. And so, again, you're just being stubborn. You don't have good reasons why you don't engage in these things. And so, essentially, there are a couple of attacks that develop that are related around some similar types of things. We'll kind of summarize them all and a Christian response to them toward the end of the lecture. As I mentioned on Tuesday, in the first century, I think it was Tuesday, it might have been last Thursday. In the first century, there's not a lot written about government, views on government, those kind of things in the New Testament. There's some things related to how do you live in the world, and relationships between the church and the world. And those ideas continued into the second century. As early Christians were writing on a variety of topics, they continued to try and address how does the church relate to society. And a lot of it was wrapped up with the notion of two ways. And so frequently you'll see in a lot of those early documents talking about the two ways. The way of life, the way of death. Right? The narrow way, the broad way. Jesus refers to it in Matthew. And so there is the notion that there is essentially two paths that you can follow, with the encouragement being follow the path of Christ. Another trope that shows up in a lot of early Christian writing is the idea of Christians as a third race. There are Jews, there are Gentiles, and there are Christians. Right? And so instead of breaking the world into two, right, there are Greeks and there are barbarians. There are Jews, there are Gentiles. Christians are something new, something different from these binaries. And so they developed this idea of the third race. Christians also rejected the worship of gods, even the civil ceremonies, and sometimes even serving in the military, because often many military members were expected to be devoted to either a mystery religion or some other sort of deity. But there was another way in which Christians thought about how do you relate to society. And again, it kind of breaks down into two. For some, the belief was you needed to be radically opposed to anything in pagan society. There needs to be a break between Christianity and paganism, between Christians and the rest of the world. And that included things like philosophy. And so some early Christians argued that any of the heresies that developed, that we'll talk about on Tuesday, any of these false teachings came from reading philosophy. And so you read these Greek documents, you read these Roman philosophers, And then you bring those ideas into Christianity and you create a false sort of teaching. On the other hand, you had some people who wanted to see or wanted to use pagan culture to try and connect with people. And so they would talk about areas where there was contact between Christianity and philosophy. Right? So talking about how some of the philosophers were monotheists, might be a way. Or there might be an ethical connection. Right? And so the idea about if there's something good in pagan culture, it can be used. And one area that was particularly important was the idea of the logos, or the logos, but you shouldn't say logos. That's the one that you shouldn't say. You can say logos or you can say logos, but you shouldn't say anyway. So we'll say more about this doctrine later on. But essentially this was an idea within Greek philosophy that we touched on when we were talking about backgrounds of this universal reason. And so many Christians who believed in accommodation used that to try and talk about Christ because of John using logos to talk about Jesus. Also important in the 2nd century was the development of the apologists. The apologists were a set of Christian authors whose writings were written as a defense, or whose writings were a defense of Christianity. Coming from the Greek word apologia, meaning defense, right? Not apology in the sense of saying I'm sorry, right? So they weren't saying I'm sorry, I'm Christian. They were defending Christianity. And so these people were individuals who stepped up to defend Christianity. And it appears like the 2nd century is the flourishing period for these individuals. Toward the 3rd century, things start going in a different direction. Before this, a lot of the writing had some defense of Christianity, but largely it was written just to Christian groups. It wasn't written to outsiders. And so these are kind of written towards outsiders, though whether these outsiders actually ever read any of these texts or not, they're written as. Apparently the earliest text, as far as an apologetic text, outside the New Testament is possibly a document known as the Preaching of Peter. Not written by Peter, it was written somewhere between 100 and 110. No copies of it exist, so we don't know much about the contents. Our knowledge of it only comes because people like Origen, Clement of Alexandria, who are individuals we'll meet in the 3rd century, they talk about the preaching of Peter, or they mention some things related to that. So that's the only way we know about that. Other early apologists included individuals like Quadratus and Aristides. Here too, we only know a little about them based on other writings. For Quadratus, we know about him because of an early church historian named Eusebius, who was a historian of the 4th century, tells us that Quadratus had written a work to the Emperor Hadrian, and he says, it was a defense for our religion because some wicked men were trying to trouble the Christians. It is still extant among many of the brethren, and we have a copy ourselves. This is Eusebius talking. From it can be seen the clear proof of his intellect and apostolic orthodoxy. He shows his early days by what he says as follows in his own words. For the works of our Savior were always present, for they were true. Those who were cured, those who rose from the dead, remained for some time after he had gone, so that some of them survived even till our own time. So what appears to be the case with Quadratus is that at least part of his apology, right, his apologetic work, was based on the idea that Jesus had healed some people, raised some people from the dead, and they were still living and could be talked to at the time Quadratus was writing. Right? So he's emphasizing the historicity of these things because there are people that experience these things you can talk to. Aristides, his work was discovered in the 1880s, possibly also written to the Emperor Hadrian. It is focused as an attack on the gods of other lands and defending the God of Christianity. It also includes kind of a criticism of Jews because they did not accept Christ. When we get to the time of Antoninus Pius and Marcus Aurelius, there are other apologists. Apollinaris, who was also a bishop, wrote during the time of Marcus Aurelius, quote, "To claim for Christians the rainstorm on the Danube that had given water to Roman troops and struck the enemy with lightning." Right? So evidently there was this event where the Roman troops were running low on water, they're facing their enemy, right? There's a battle getting ready to take place, and the enemy troops are struck by lightning, and rain falls, and the troops have water. And so Apollinaris is saying, God did that. Right? The Christian God did that, supplied these troops. He talks about some other issues that we'll talk about later, mostly dealing with practice and some other heresies. Athenagoras also wrote to Marcus Aurelius. His work wasn't known until the 10th century, when it was discovered. In it, Athenagoras will quote from Plato, Aristotle, some Stoics, some Pythagoreans, right? And so his focus is to connect with some of these philosophers, try to show some comparisons between Greek and philosophy and Christianity. There's also the Epistle to Diognetus. The only manuscript of this document was found in 1435 and then lost in a fire in 1870. We don't know who wrote it. We don't really know who the recipient was. We don't know. He's referred to as Your Excellency or His Excellency Diognetus, but there wasn't an emperor by that name. Maybe it was a Roman governor, maybe it was some sort of other official, but it appears to be written to some sort of official, who, as it's presented, is a person wanting to know about Christianity. And so it's kind of laying out what Christianity is comparing that to idolatry, to Christianity. There were other apologists as well, but by the 3rd century, a lot of writing is focused on heretics. And so it's kind of back that internal focus again.